All right, diving in today, getting philosophical, really philosophical. We're taking on Indian Buddhist philosophy and how they understand the mind.
Big topic.
Huge. But we've got an excellent guide, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry. They cover like 15 centuries of thought on this, from the really early Buddhist texts all the way to later developments.
Yeah, it's remarkable how much ground they managed to cover.
So our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to break down some of the most influential Buddhist ideas about the mind.
I'm game if you are.
Oh, I'm in. So we're talking about that radical not-self idea. We're going to look at consciousness, perception, intentionality, the whole works, and we're going to do it in a way that makes sense, philosophically.
Because if anyone's going to appreciate the intricacies of Buddhist thought on these matters, it's going to be philosophers.
Right. It challenges so many of the assumptions, these kind of like baseline ideas about the self and consciousness that have dominated Western philosophy for centuries.
And that's why it's so relevant, even today. So many contemporary debates in philosophy of mind are still wrestling with these very same issues that Buddhist thinkers tackled centuries ago.
Okay, so let's start with that foundational shift. Early Buddhism emerged in a context where the Upanishadic idea of the Atman, this permanent self, was kind of the dominant view, and the Buddha comes along and says, nope, not quite.
He really flipped the script. Early Buddhists said, look, there is no such thing as this enduring independent self. The Stanford Encyclopedia entry puts it very clearly, saying that we're essentially a collection, a bundle of physical and psychological components.
And processes.
And processes, yes. Constantly interacting and changing. That's the core of the not-self doctrine, anatta in Pali or anatma in Sanskrit.
And this became one of the things that really set Buddhism apart from other philosophical systems in India at that time?
Absolutely. It was a key point of distinction in how they approached these big questions of existence and identity.
Now, here's where it gets even more interesting for us, right? Even within Buddhist scholarship, this whole not-self thing, it's caused quite a bit of debate. Some early scholars tried to draw parallels between not-self and some Upanishadic ideas, like maybe there's a core consciousness or a witnessing self that's actually kind of similar.
It's understandable from a historical perspective to see those attempts at finding some common ground.
Yeah, like maybe there's a little bit of overlap.
Exactly. But as scholarship progressed, a more nuanced understanding emerged. Those early interpretations, they kind of faded. Instead, the dominant view now, and the one that's backed up by those later Buddhist concepts like the mind stream, the citta santana, the life continuum mind, the bhavagacita, and even that repository consciousness, the alaya vijnana.
Those are some mouthful words.
They are. But those ideas were developed to directly avoid any notion of a traditional permanent self.
So it's like Buddhism had this internal dialogue, refining its own understanding.
Right. It kept coming back to that core idea of a Natman, just really hammering it in.
So those later concepts weren't like, oh, here's a self by another name. They were actually safeguards to really make sure that the not-self idea was, like, watertight.
Exactly. The text makes that clear. Those frameworks were there specifically to address those metaphysical problems that come up if you try to hold on to the Atman concept.
Okay, so what were the main arguments for this not-self view? It couldn't have just been like, take our word for it. There had to be some good reasons, some logic behind it.
Oh, there were, and good ones, too. The Stanford Encyclopedia entry lists several key arguments. The first one is pretty straightforward. They basically say this metaphysical idea of a self, as it's traditionally been understood, is just wrong. There's no evidence for it.
Straight to the point.
Right. Then they go on to argue that you can't point to your physical body and say, that's my permanent self, nor can you point to your consciousness and say, that's it. Neither of those work.
Interesting.
And then they take it even further, challenging the whole idea of a self existing separately from our experience, moment to moment.
So it's not like you have this self and then it's having experiences. It's more intertwined.
Exactly. And this leads into their argument about language, which is really relevant to how we understand everyday psychology. They analyze this sense of I and mine and say it comes from habits, linguistic habits, and these conceptual frameworks we've built up. It's not some reflection of a true, unchanging entity.
So it's more about how we think and talk about ourselves than some deep reality.
Precisely. And this all ties back into their analysis of consciousness. Denying the permanent self is a key part of how they understand consciousness.
It's not just some abstract metaphysical point either, this not-self doctrine. It's supposed to address suffering, right?
Right. This is where the philosophy gets very practical, very ethical. The not-self doctrine, it's not just a theory about reality, it's a tool to alleviate suffering.
A tool. Okay, how so?
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia entry explains that this attachment we have to I, this idea of a permanent self, that's the root of so many negative emotions. Selfishness, craving, hatred, pride, all that stuff stems from this illusion.
I can see how that would lead to problems.
And those emotions, those egocentric emotions, they fuel that feeling of unsatisfactoriness, dukkha, the kind of unease that's just like baked into unenlightened existence.
So understanding not self is supposed to be like an antidote to that.
Exactly. It helps dismantle the very foundation of suffering by showing us that this I we're clinging to isn't real. It paves the way for nirvaha, the cessation of dukkha.
So if you take away the illusion of a self, you take away the fuel for those harmful attachments and the suffering they cause.
You got it. It's recognizing that everything is impermanent, interconnected, and ultimately that this self we're so attached to is just a construction.
Okay, so the deep dive goes on to explain some fundamental principles in Buddhist thought, and one that keeps popping up is the middle path.
Right, that's kind of their guiding principle.
So what's the middle path all about, especially when we're talking about mind and self?
Well, it's about avoiding extremes. It goes for everything, really. In terms of our emotions and desires, it's about steering clear of excessive indulgence, but also avoiding extreme asceticism.
It's finding that balance.
Exactly. And philosophically, the middle path avoids the extremes of eternalism, which is that Upanishadic view of a permanent self, and annihilationism, which says that we just cease to exist at death.
And the source material, they pull this quote from the Sayutta Nikaya saying that this middle path, it leads to insight and wisdom, produces calm, knowledge, enlightenment, and nirvana.
It's the path to awakening.
So it's not just about being moderate in your behavior, it's
Yeah.
about finding a balanced way of seeing reality itself.
Right, and that balanced view is tied to what they call the 3 marks of existence. It's how they understand reality.
And those are,
Well, first you've got unsatisfactoriness, dukkha. It's the recognition that suffering, or unease, is woven into the fabric of existence.
it's not just like bad things happening, it's more fundamental than that.
It is. Even when things seem good, there's this underlying sense that it can't last, because everything's temporary. And realizing the nature of dukkha, that's the first step towards liberation.
Got it. What's the second mark?
Impermanence, anicca. That's the idea that everything, all compounded things, are in constant flux. Nothing stays the same.
So it's like Heraclitus' river. You can never step in the same river twice.
Exactly. They have a whole theory of momentariness called Kanchikavada, which says that every phenomenon, both physical and mental, pops in and out of existence in an instant.
Wow. Okay. So that really challenges our everyday experience of things seeming solid and lasting.
It does. And then the third mark brings us back to that core concept.
Not self and Atman.
Yep. This one challenges that deep-seated belief we have that there's a fixed I behind all our experiences. Instead, it's showing us that human existence is this flow, this constant process of interconnected physical and mental events.
Which brings us to the 5 aggregates, the skandha.
The building blocks of what we mistakenly call self.
Right. So these 5 aggregates, they're what's left when you take away this idea of a permanent self, right?
That's it. They're the components that make up what we conventionally think of as a person.
So let's break them down. What are they?
Okay, so you've got material form, which is rupa. Then you've got sensations, which is vedana. Then there's apperception, which is sajanya. Then there's volitions, which is saskara. And finally, there's consciousness, which is vijnana.
A lot to unpack there. And the crucial point, the one that really challenges the idea of self, is that these aggregates, they're understood in purely causal terms. They don't belong to a self. They are what we mistakenly think of as self.
Exactly. There's no separate entity that has these aggregates. They are the self, or at least what we perceive as self.
It's not like you have a self that has these 5 things. It's that the interaction of these 5 things is what creates the illusion of self.
Exactly. They arise and pass away, dependently, constantly changing. And it's in that flow, in that impermanence, that we get this mistaken idea of a unified and enduring self.
Okay, so let's delve a little deeper into each of these aggregates. First up, we've got feeling, the Dhammaskanda. That's basically how our senses feel, right?
It is. It's about the pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral quality of what we experience through the senses. It's that immediate feel of things.
And it comes from the contact between our senses and the objects out there in the world, right?
Yeah, that contact is crucial. And it's also shaped by our past karma. Our actions have consequences, and those consequences influence how we experience the world.
Interesting. So it's not just about the object itself, it's about our history with those kinds of experiences.
Exactly. Then there's apperception, the Sanjaya skandha. This is where we start recognizing and understanding what we're perceiving.
It's more than just raw sensation, it's like our brain making sense of it.
Right. It's about comprehending those distinguishing marks of an object. It pulls in memories, learned associations, expectations, all that stuff.
The source even compares it to Aristotle's sensus communis and Kant's transcendental unity of apperception. Pretty heady stuff.
It is. But it shows how Saija goes beyond just passively receiving sensory data. It's about actively constructing an understanding of what we're experiencing.
So it's like the first layer of interpretation, moving from feeling to understanding.
Exactly. Then you've got volitions, the sasaga skandha. These are all those mental formations, the intentions and dispositions that kind of drive us forward.
So it's about our will, our motivations, our
All right.
choices.
All of that. And it includes both the conscious choices we make and those unconscious habits that we've developed over time.
The things that make us who we are.
And those volitions, they shape our future. They keep us bound to this cycle of existence, the samsara.
Right. So they're kind of like the karmic engine.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And finally, there's consciousness, the vijnan skandha. This is the most basic level of awareness, just registering that something is present to our senses.
So it's before we even know what it is, it's just that initial something's there feeling.
Right. It's distinct from apperception because it's not about identifying the object. It's just that raw awareness.
Now, one thing that jumps out is that material form, rupa, that's the only aggregate that's considered purely physical. The other four, they're all mental. But even when they're talking about the physical world, they seem to be approaching it from the perspective of experience rather than like strict physics.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The Stanford Encyclopedia entry mentions that even the most basic units, like atoms, which they call rupan, they're seen as lacking those qualities that we perceive until they come together, until they form aggregates.
It's like those qualities emerge from the interaction, not from the things themselves.
Right. They're saying even the physical world is fundamentally intertwined with experience.
Okay, now the source material gets into consciousness and cognition in more detail, starting with the Abhidharma. I think a lot of our listeners might not be familiar with that.
Yeah, it's a big area of Buddhist thought.
So, can you give us a quick rundown of what it's all about?
Sure. The Abhidharma, it's often translated as higher doctrine. It's a more systematic, kind of scholastic development of the Buddha's teachings.
So it's like taking those early ideas and really fleshing them out.
Right. And the focus is on Dharma, which can mean a couple of things.
Yeah.
It can refer to the Buddha's teachings themselves, but it can also refer to the basic elements, the building blocks of existence and experience.
The fundamental units of reality.
Exactly. And in the Abhidharma, Dharma often means those momentary cognitive events, those flashes of awareness that happen in an instant. They call that vijnana.
Okay, so they're breaking down experience into these tiny little bits.
Right. And there were different schools of Abhidharma Theravada, Sarvastivada, Sautrantika, and they all had their own interpretations and models of how this all worked.
So it wasn't just one unified system. It was more like a lively debate about how to understand the mind.
It was. They all had their own ways of interpreting those early Buddhist teachings.
And they created these really intricate systems. They had those mnemonic lists, the mata, that summarized key topics, and then they'd write commentaries and build these complex philosophical structures.
A lot like other Indian philosophical traditions, like Sakya. But of course, the content was very different.
And we can't forget Vasubandhu's Abhidharmakosha. That's one of the key texts that brings a lot of these Abhidharma perspectives together.
Right. It's a major work. And from there, the deep dive goes into sensation and perception, the indriya. It contrasts the Brahmanical view, which often saw the senses as connected to deities, with the Buddhist perspective.
So in the Brahmanical view, the senses are more divine, more connected to a higher reality.
Yeah, some of those ideas can be found in the Argi Veda and the Upanishads. They often saw the senses as arising from a direct contact between the self and the world, kind of like the senses were revealing those ultimate realities.
But Buddhism takes a different approach.
It does. They see the senses more as functional capacities, almost like tools. In fact, they call them receptacles of experience, indriya dhyana.
So instead of conduits to a higher self, they're more like the interface between our internal world and the external world.
That's a good way to put it. And Vasubandhu, he goes into great detail analyzing the causal relationships between the senses and their corresponding bases, the ayatana.
So they're really breaking down the mechanics of perception, the way the senses actually work.
Exactly. And then we get to this idea of mental proliferation, Prapanya. It's about how our minds are constantly adding to, interpreting, and sometimes distorting our experiences.
So it's not just that we see something, it's that we immediately start judging it, comparing it, and fitting it into our pre-existing ideas about the world.
Right. We have all these expectations, judgments, desires, and we're constantly categorizing everything. It's all linked to language and these conceptual frameworks we've developed over time.
It's like our minds never stop working.
They don't. And that tendency, Papanka, it can obscure our direct experience of reality. Like it's adding layers of interpretation onto what's actually there.
And the source suggests that this inherent duality in perception between subjective sensation and objective awareness, it kind of pushes Buddhist thought towards either metaphysical idealism or phenomenology.
Right, it leads to some big questions.
Like, is reality ultimately mental, or is it just that our experience shapes how we perceive the world?
It's a crucial question. If Prapanyaka is so pervasive, if our minds are always shaping our experience, then what can we say about an external reality? And that tension between idealism and phenomenology, it's a theme that runs through Buddhist thought. Different schools took different stances on it.
Okay, and then there's this whole business of imposing self and other onto things.
Right, that's where things start to get sticky. Prapanyaka leads us to reify things, to see them as separate and independent when they're not. It's how we end up with dualistic thinking.
So it's not just that we're interpreting the world, it's that those interpretations then create this illusion of separation.
Exactly, and that illusion is a major source of suffering.
Okay, so let's move on to consciousness itself. The source uses the term vijnana, and they actually provide this formula to illustrate how it arises. It starts with, like, the eye informs, then leads to visual consciousness, then contact, feeling, perception, thinking, more mental proliferation. It's like a chain reaction.
It is. It's showing how consciousness isn't this singular independent thing. It arises in relation to our senses.
So it's not like there's one consciousness controlling everything. It's more like these specific types of consciousness tied to each sense.
Right. You have visual consciousness, auditory consciousness, and so on. And the source points out that in those early Buddhist texts, sometimes vijnana is used almost interchangeably with sajya, apperception.
So sometimes it's about that initial grasping of an object.
Right. But it's important to remember that the connections between perception and thought, those are often driven by habitual patterns, by that mental proliferation we were just talking about. Our minds just keep on spinning.
So even our conscious experience is subject to those habits and tendencies.
Absolutely.
But the source also mentions that vijnana is often used to refer to consciousness that's tied to a specific sense faculty, like visual awareness.
Right, and mental awareness too.
Right.
That's called madhavijnana. And here's a crucial point. Consciousness, it doesn't just arise from sensation alone. Attention is also key.
So it's not enough to just have something in front of our eyes. We have to actually pay attention to it.
Exactly. Think about it. We're constantly bombarded with sensory input. But it's only when we direct our attention to something that it pops into our conscious awareness.
That makes sense. It's like filtering out all the noise and focusing on a specific signal.
Right. And some passages in the Digha Nikaya suggest that there's this really deep interdependence between mind, body, and consciousness. It's not a simple linear relationship.
Okay, and the source revisits that tripartite model of cognition. Remember, the phenomenal world, the act of apprehension, and the type of consciousness. And they point out that the world we're talking about here, it's not necessarily some independent external reality. It's more like the world as it appears to us, shaped by our minds.
Right. They use the term lokasajja, which basically means world perception. It arises from that mental proliferation we've been talking about. And this, again, leans towards that idealist interpretation.
It's like consciousness is the primary reality, and the world we experience is arising within that.
It's a radical way of looking at things. And while not all Buddhist schools went fully down that idealist path, it's definitely a strong theme, especially as we move towards Yogacara.
Okay, so let's talk about intentionality satana. The early Buddhist texts connect intention to karma, right?
Right. Our intentions shape our actions, which have karmic consequences.
But the Abhidharma takes it a step further, saying that all cognitive states are inherently intentional.
Right. They're always about something, always directed towards an object, even if that object is just an idea or a mental image.
So there's no such thing as just like pure objectless awareness.
Not according to the Abhidharma. The Vaibhika school, they were very clear about that. Consciousness is always about something.
And then later you have thinkers like Dignaga and Dharmakirti who went really deep into the whole nature of intentionality.
They developed this whole logico-epistemological tradition, trying to figure out how knowledge works.
And Vasubandhu, he defines action, karman, as volition, satana, and its result.
Right, it's not just the act itself, but the intention behind it. He says that all actions, whether they're physical, verbal, or mental, they all start with intention.
So even just thinking something is an action.
It is, in a karmic sense.
Yeah.
In all this intentionality, it comes from those residual impressions of past experiences, the vasana.
The traces left by everything we've done and thought.
Exactly. Those past volitions, they shape our present intentions and actions. It's all connected. And then we have that repository consciousness, the alaya vijnana that we talked about earlier.
Right, the storehouse of those karmic seeds.
Exactly. It's how Vasubandhu explains how those past traces can influence us now, how they shape our motivations and actions.
Okay, and then there's attention, avartana. It's not a big deal in the early texts, but in the Abhidharma, it gets more attention, so to speak.
Right. The key point here is that just having something in front of your senses, that's not enough for conscious awareness. You need attention.
So it's not just about the input, it's about how we focus on that input.
Exactly. Buddhaghosa, for example, he argues that consciousness needs an objective support. It needs something to latch onto, even if it can arise without, explicitly focusing.
Okay, but the general idea is that you don't really have conscious cognition without attention.
That's the main takeaway. Think of it this way. Your senses are always processing information, but it's only when you pay attention to something that it becomes a conscious experience.
So attention is what brings it into focus, and the source material emphasizes that for Buddhists, particularly those on the path to liberation, understanding causation from the perspective of consciousness is crucial.
Because it's about understanding how we create our own suffering.
Right, and how we can free ourselves from it. And they point out that feelings and perceptions, those things arise from contact with objects, but they fall within the domain of consciousness.
So they're subject to those same habits, those same patterns of mental proliferation.
Okay, the deep dive then jumps into this whole area of mind and mental constituents.
The Abhidharma schools, they were big on analyzing the mind.
Yeah, they wanted to break down experience into its most basic parts. They were talking about sensations, volitions, all those tiny little elements of mental activity.
And they did it in incredible detail. They created these elaborate taxonomies trying to map out the entire landscape of consciousness.
And the ultimate goal of all this analysis, it wasn't just to create some abstract system, right? It was to understand how those mental processes and karma work together.
Right. They wanted to understand the roots of suffering. And the ultimate aim was soteriological. They were trying to figure out how to identify and counteract those afflictive tendencies, the kliyamanas.
So by understanding the mechanics of the mind, they could figure out how to break free from suffering.
Exactly. It was a form of mental phenomenology, but with a very practical goal.
And one of the things they talk about in this section is cognitive support, or alambana. The early texts talk about these deep-seated habits, these afflictive tendencies that can even stick around for people who are quite advanced in their practice.
Yeah, those tendencies are stubborn.
And the Abhidharma schools, they explore the limitations of our senses, both because of how they're structured and because of the nature of the objects we encounter.
Vasubandhu, he even outlines a classification of these different kinds of resistance that limit how our senses operate.
So it's like our senses can only take in so much, and they're influenced by the objects themselves.
Right. And he argues that the mind is primarily equipped to deal with abstract mental objects, not so much with those concrete physical things.
It's interesting that they say cognition follows the sense, not the object. Like, we talk about visual consciousness, not consciousness of the visible.
It's like the structure of our senses shapes how we experience the world, even if it feels like we're directly perceiving things.
Right, it's not just a passive reception. Okay, now we get into the really fun part.
Theories of mind.
Yeah, this is where we see all those different explanations for how the mind works, how it stays continuous, and how karma operates, even though there's no permanent self.
It's a real philosophical puzzle.
So we've got the Theravadas life continuum mind, Pavagacita, the Sarvastivada's appropriation, Prapti in the mental stream, the Sautrantikas seeds, Bija in the mental stream, and then the Yogacaras repository consciousness, the Alaya Vijnana.
And we can't forget those Padgalavans, the personalists, who tried to carve out a space for a conventional person within the framework of not self.
Right, so let's start with mind and causation.
Okay, so the idea here is that Vijnana, cognitive awareness, it plays two roles.
It's both those individual moments of consciousness, like those little flashes of awareness.
And it's also this underlying principle of continuity, what gives us that sense of personal identity over time.
So it's both the fleeting moments and the thing that connects those moments.
Right. And it's seen as both a conditioned phenomenon, something that arises because of other things, and a conditioning factor, something that influences other things.
A two-way street.
Exactly. The Sarvastivada school, they got really detailed with this. They had their 6 causes, hetu, and 4 conditions, prataya, trying to map out all the factors that influence experience.
It's like they were trying to create a formula for consciousness.
They were, but they ran into some trouble explaining how karma could operate across time. How effects could arise from causes that were distant in the past.
Right, because if everything is momentary, how can something from the past have an impact on the present?
Exactly. And that's where those ideas of the mind continuum and the repository consciousness came in.
Okay, so let's talk about the life continuum mind, the Pavagacita in Theravada Buddhism.
So they took that idea of the mind's continuity and expanded on it. They said it wasn't just about a series of cognitive events. It was a fundamental factor that conditions conscious awareness.
So it's not just a stream of thoughts, it's the stream itself.
Right. Think of it like a flowing river or a string of beads.
Yeah.
It's what provides that underlying continuity.
And some modern interpretations see it as a kind of subliminal level of mental activity, like the stuff happening beneath the surface.
Right. It's carrying those latent dispositions and patterns even when we're not consciously thinking about them.
Okay, so the Sarvastivada, they came up with appropriation, or prapti. This is a specific type of dharma, one of those fundamental elements of existence, but this one is dissociated from thought.
Right. And they said that prapti is what keeps karma going. Even though everything's momentary, it's what allows those mental factors to stick together and create a continuous stream of experience.
So it's like the glue that holds everything together.
Exactly. But it was a controversial idea because it seemed to go against that principle of momentariness. Even Vasubandhu questioned it.
Okay, and then we have the Sautrantika school. They came up with the seeds theory using Beja.
Yeah, they were responding to those vibhushas.
Right, so they used the seed metaphor to talk about those latent karmic tendencies, the potential for things to happen in the future.
Right. Instead of some permanent entity, they talked about the inherent capacity for things to unfold, to change, to grow.
So it's more like a potentiality than an actual thing.
Right. They used memory as an example. They said memory isn't like some stored trace in the mind. It's more like the seed for remembering something.
It's the potential for that memory to arise.
Exactly. And the Sautrantikas, they got into some big debates with the Vaipikas about what happens when mental activity stops, like in deep sleep.
Right, because if everything is momentary and there's a gap in mental activity, how does consciousness start up again?
Exactly. And those debates highlight their different views on the nature of mind.
The Vaibhakas, they appealed to dharmas existing across time.
Right. They were committed to that idea.
Yeah.
But the Sautrantikas, they rejected that.